So if you're working as a health, fitness, or a wellness professional and you run into clients that are dealing with fibromyalgia type pain symptoms, these folks are usually pretty miserable and they're almost never receiving any type of actual answers as to why they're dealing with this issue or what they can do to improve it in any way. They're usually just taught, oh yeah, it's just genetics, sorry about your luck. So in this video, I want to help you understand the most common underlying causes. We're going to go over a bunch of studies here that show that this information is in the scientific literature, but I'm going to help you understand why it's not really being taught to doctors. It's okay if I'm standing in front of these. You don't need to see them. I'll make them bigger. Just keep in mind that I'm not a doctor. I'm not giving any medical advice in this video or telling you medical advice to give to your clients. I'm just a stand-up comic turned nutrition author, because when I lost my voice for 8 years, 23 different doctors couldn't help me figure out my answers, and I had to dig for my own answers. So now I teach health professionals how to help their clients see real results by working on correcting the actual underlying cause of what's creating their problems instead of just trying to cover up the symptoms. And what's really interesting is that when I found my answers, since then, it's been 20 years now that I've been doing this research, and I've found all the information that I needed to fix my voice issues and all the digestive problems I was having in the medical literature. And yet none of those 23 doctors knew any of that stuff. So sometimes we have to dig for our own answers so we understand the right questions that we can ask our doctor to really get some answers going. So what we want to look at here is we want to look at why it's so confusing when we're looking at fibromyalgia. There is not one cause for fibromyalgia. We need to understand the different situations that can create this for our clients in order to really be able to help them improve it. So for most people dealing with this fibromyalgia type pain symptoms, it's usually going to be about the way that their body is generating energy. So the body really likes to generate energy through cellular respiration. And what's needed to do that is oxygen. So there are certain situations in the body where oxygen is not really available at that tissue cellular level for it to really be able to generate energy with that oxygen. So when that's not available, the body has this backup system, and it can create energy through fermentation. And it'll do this when oxygen is not available. Now, when it makes energy this way, it's less efficient. The body can make like 19 times more energy from the same fuel source as it could doing this way than it can when it's creating it through fermentation. So this is kind of like a not so great way to create energy. But the real trouble is that when the body creates energy through this cellular respiration where oxidation is involved, and the byproduct or the exhaust that comes from creating energy this way is carbon dioxide. So we know that when we exhale, we're just breathing out carbon dioxide. So that's a really easy way to get rid of the byproduct of creating energy this way. But creating energy this way, the byproduct is lactic acid. And that can be harder for the body to get rid of. It can convert it into glucose and then use that glucose, but there's some situations we'll talk about in a minute that can kind of, hamper that a little bit. And if the body is using this all the time, this lactic acid can really accumulate. This is meant to just be used for like short bursts of energy. It's not meant to be used all the time. So when we're looking at this pain, it's usually from a lactic acid accumulation, and that lactic acid is accumulating in that interstitial fluid and all around the cells there in the tissues, and it's basically like frying nerve endings and creating a lot of pain that way. So this accumulation is because somebody's usually using this fermentation way of making energy more often than they really should, and it's usually because there's oxygen utilization issues. So if somebody's making their energy this way, they're using a less efficient way, and they're usually not going to have very much energy. That's often why you see this chronic fatigue syndrome so commonly, associated with this fibromyalgia type issues. So the person doesn't have any energy because their body's trying to make energy all the time in a way that's not very efficient. So the reason that this comes about is we need to understand that there can be different issues that are creating this oxygen utilization issue. So it's not going to be the same for every client. So one thing that we want to look at is that we need to understand the Bohr effect. And what that tells us is that when the pH of the blood, it really needs to stay in a pretty narrow range for the body to function at all. And when it starts to move too far, either on the acidic side or the alkaline side, the body does what it can to try to adjust that because it wants to stay in a good range. But the Bohr effect tells us that when the blood leans a little bit too far on that alkaline side, now oxygen can't leave the blood and get down to the tissues where it needs to be to generate this energy. So when the blood is leaning too alkaline, the doctor might put like a pulse oximeter on your client and be like, oh man, your oxygen's great. Look at that. Way to go. Good job. But what they're not understanding is that because the blood is leaning too far on this alkaline side and the Bohr effect has kicked in, the oxygen is trapped in the blood. It can't get down to where it needs to be. So now what is the body going to do? Oh man, I don't have oxygen. I can't create energy. Oh yeah, I got this other thing I can do. I can create energy through fermentation, and at least I can function. But while it's doing that too often, it's creating excess lactic acid, and that's creating these pain symptoms. So to get an idea if this is a problem for your clients, you can just have them look at their breath rate. They can just get like a timer or just look at this timer on their phone, set it for 60 seconds, and then just relax, try to breathe normal, and count the number of inhales that they take in that 60-second period. So don't have them count inhale 1, exhale 2, just count the inhales. And we want to see what is the number of breaths that they take in that 60-second period. Because basically this is one of the backup mechanisms the body has to try to adjust the pH of that blood so that oxygen can be utilized correctly. So if the blood is leaning a little bit too far on the alkaline side, the body will slow the rate at which it's breathing in an effort to hold on to more of this CO2. Hold on to more of the carbon dioxide because CO2 is acidic. And if it can hold on to more of that CO2 instead of expelling it when we breathe out, then it can help balance out the pH of that blood. It can help the pH become a little bit more acidic and balance it out, and now oxygen can be utilized correctly. So the body will slow the rate at which we're breathing in an effort to fix that problem. So we can just look at our client's breath rate, and if their breath rate is like 12 or below, then that's going to be an indication that the blood is leaning too far on that alkaline side. We really want to see their breath rate somewhere between like 14 and 18. That's pretty optimal. But if a client is below 12, that's an indication that the blood is leaning too alkaline. So now we know that the oxygen can't get where it needs to be to create energy, and they're probably creating most of their energy this way and accumulating all this lactic acid in the process. So keep in mind that the client just trying to change the rate at their breathing is not going to fix the problem. This is an automatic kind of thing. You need to fix the actual underlying cause of the issue. But one step that they can take is something called potato breathing. It's just a method of breathing for an exercise. So if they're able to go for a walk, a lot of these clients have a hard time exercising. We'll talk about exercise in a second, but just it's so painful for them. But if they can go for a walk and they can close their mouth and only breathe through their nose for that whole 30-minute walk or so, then that has the ability to kind of allow the body to hold on to more of that CO2 and kind of change the set point of that CO2. So they don't want to talk during their walk. If it's too hard for them to keep their mouth closed, they're probably walking too fast and doing too hard of an exercise. They want to make it easier just so they can keep their mouth closed and just breathe through their nose that whole time. That has the ability to help some clients a little bit, but we really need to work on fixing the actual underlying cause to see real lasting results. So one of the most common causes is high blood sugar. So let's look at this study here on obesity and insulin resistance in fibromyalgia patients. And their conclusion was fibromyalgia patients have a higher degree of insulin resistance compared to healthy age-matched controls. And I'm going to put the links to all these studies in the description below. And I'll also put a link to another study that was on insulin resistance that pretty much showed that this is the most common cause, but they retracted the whole thing because it seems like somebody didn't want people to really understand this. And they were like, oh man, they didn't turn in these papers right. But this whole expensive study that really showed that insulin resistance is a really common issue for this got retracted. But you can still see it below. It's kind of comical how that happens. But we need to understand that it's really often about this insulin resistance because when a client is insulin resistant, remember that they're not really processing glucose correctly. So then that glucose accumulates in the bloodstream. And one thing that we need to understand about high blood sugar is that calcium likes to follow sugar, just like you would follow the ice cream truck when you were 8. Calcium follows sugar. So when sugar is high in the bloodstream, calcium will leave places where it's supposed to be, like in the tissues and such, and it will go to where the sugar is. Now we have a lot more calcium in the blood, and calcium is one of the most alkaline substances on the planet. So this excess calcium in the bloodstream has the ability to alkalize the bloodstream. Now the bloodstream's leaning too far on that alkaline side, the Bohr effect kicks in, they can't use oxygen correctly, and they have to create energy through this fermentation process. So helping a client become less insulin resistant is a really big deal, and we see this in a lot of our type 2 diabetics. They're usually going to have a slower breath rate, indicating that the blood is leaning too far on the alkaline, just because this calcium has been displaced. Now, another thing that really helps us understand that calcium is being displaced is we'll look at this study here on the modulation of pressure pain thresholds during and following isometric contractions in patients with fibromyalgia. And they basically said that they found that fibromyalgia patients have a harder time with their muscles relaxing correctly. They kind of stay more in that contracted state, and in that more contracted state, it can increase pain sensitivity. So it's easier for pain to come on when the muscles are staying in that more contracted state. And what we understand is that calcium is one of the more important minerals at the tissue level needed to allow those muscles to relax. There's different minerals involved in contracting and in relaxing, and calcium is very important for that relaxation process in those muscles. And when you have a client that's dealing with a lot of Charlie horses or muscle cramps in their calves and such, a lot of times too much calcium is being pulled out. It's usually because they're eating too many carbohydrates or sugars, but other things can cause too much calcium to be pulled out. But this study is showing that this is seen a lot when we're looking at fibromyalgia, and it makes sense if all this calcium is being pulled out of the tissues and their blood is leaning too alkaline. So this is another thing that lines up, is just staying in this contracted state. And I'll put another paper below that talks about this lack of CO2 that can happen with type 2 diabetics. So it's very common to see all of these things together. It doesn't mean every client is going to have this situation going on, but it is very common. So what we want to do with these clients is first understand, well, is your blood sugar high? You know, a client can pick up a glucometer at a pharmacy for $40 and just look at their fasting blood sugar. And if that fasting blood sugar is over 100, that's a really strong indication that they're leaning or starting to lean on that insulin resistance side, and blood sugar is going to be going higher in the blood. Now, there are circumstances where somebody can be insulin resistant and that blood sugar will come up in an okay range because they're just making a whole lot of insulin to make that happen. So we really need to have a doctor look at their fasting insulin to really know if they're leaning insulin resistant. But if a client's fasting blood sugar is like 110, well, that's a really strong sign that they're leaning insulin resistant. It should not be that high in a fasted state in the morning. So with these clients, the best step seems to be a non-keto, low-carb diet. And we look at this study on non-ketogenic, low-carbohydrate diet predicts lower affective distress, higher energy levels, and decreased fibromyalgia symptoms in middle-aged females. And this low-carb, non-ketogenic diet is bringing down the carbohydrates and sugars that are coming into the system, which allows the blood sugar to come down, so much calcium is not coming into the blood following that sugar. Now, keep in mind that this is not going to happen in a week and a half. Or you're not going to make a client non-insulin resistant just because they ate low carbs for a week. This takes some time to really correct that issue. And why they say a non-keto, because a keto, you're not having any carbs. You can really help a client bring down their blood sugar that way. But for some clients, in the long term, a ketogenic diet can actually make this situation worse, because a byproduct of processing carbohydrates correctly is carbon dioxide. So if a client is not eating any carbohydrates, they're doing some carnivore or keto diet situation, then they're not going to be producing the CO2 needed to help acidify the bloodstream and balance that out. Now remember, this is about processing carbohydrates. If somebody's really insulin resistant, just eating carbs is not going to raise the CO2 because they're not processing them correctly. So we need to help a client become less insulin resistant. But just because of the ability for keto to make this worse for some people, we like to see people just do a low carb diet. That way that they're still doing some carbs and can start to process some CO2 as they start to process those carbohydrates better by just not bringing in as many and slamming the body with all that high insulin levels. Now here's the problem. If the client has never done a low carb diet before, they may have some real cravings that are hard to get past. And when that's the case, it's because there are usually digestive malfunctions that are restricting the client's ability to really break the food down and get all the nutrients out of that food. So then the body starts screaming, hey, I really need some stuff. Give me those processed carbs that were really easy to break down and turn into fuel right away. Give me that stuff. So they'll have really bad cravings. So if they're having any digestive symptoms at all, it's really important that you help them fix digestive malfunctions. And if you don't know how to do that, my book Health Pro Results, chapters 3 and 4, kind of walk you through helping clients figure out which aspects of digestion are not working correctly and what steps they can take to improve that. And the book is available on Amazon, but I'll put a link in the description below so you can get the whole thing totally for free. And then you can just jump to chapters 3 and 4. And if you're a consumer that just happened upon this video because you like the topic, I'll also put a link from my book, Kick Your Fat in the Nuts, and chapters 3 and 4 of that book go over those same topics. That book is just more written for consumers, where the Health Pro Results book is really written for health professionals. But I'll put links where you can get either of those for free. I'm not going to go into digestion here. I've talked about that in a lot of videos, but if a client is having digestive malfunctions, they have to be repaired in order to fix this because they need to be able to get the nutrients out of the real food that they're eating. They're going to have to eat more real food and less of this processed carbs and junk and sugars. So it's going to be important to help them fix any low stomach acid issues or bile flow that is not working correctly, and I teach how to do all that stuff in the book. But they'll need to fix that to really see improvement. So the next possible underlying cause we want to look at is what we call an anabolic imbalance. And it was Dr. Emanuel Rivisi who helped us understand that the body has this natural circadian rhythm at the cellular level. So during the day, our body should be in a more catabolic state where it's really good at creating energy and kind of breaking things down so they can be rebuilt and renewed. And then at night, it should move into the anabolic state where it's very good at sleeping and resting and rebuilding and repairing. So both of these states are good. We want both to happen. But for a wide variety of reasons, some clients will get stuck in one of these states most of the time. And they're not moving back and forth from day to night like they should. And if they're stuck in either state, it can create a wide variety of health issues. But what we want to understand here is that if the body is really stuck in this anabolic state most of the time, it will create a situation where the body prefers to create energy through fermentation. So sometimes they're making energy through fermentation too much because they're stuck in the body's nighttime state all of the time. And then that lactic acid is going to accumulate and it's going to create a lot of trouble. And another thing that we see that's really common when we're seeing someone who's really stuck in an anabolic imbalance is we see issues like constipation. And in that state, the body likes to send more of the water through the kidneys and less to the bowels. And then the bowels become hard and dry and difficult to move and they get really constipated. Now that's just one possible cause of constipation. I talk about others in other videos. But we also see a lot of anxiety when somebody's way too stuck in that anabolic state. Because again, they're creating energy this way and they're accumulating all this lactic acid. Now I'm going to put a paper below that shows us that when these pharmaceutical companies are running these trials and such to figure out, hey, what can I do to help somebody get out of a panic attack? Well, to do that, they first have to create a panic attack to see what's going to help them get out of the panic attack. So the way they do that is they inject them with lactic acid. It's called a lactate-induced panic attack. So for some reason, we understand that injecting somebody with lactic acid creates a panic attack, but we never have the thought that, oh, wow, if lactic acid went high, wouldn't that at least create anxiety, even if it wasn't quite enough to create a panic attack? So we see a lot of clients that with anxiety that are way too far on that anabolic side and they're stuck there. And when we can pull them out and help balance that out, now the body starts to create more energy over here, less over here, the lactic acid comes down and the anxiety improves. Now, again, that's only one possible cause of anxiety. There's others, and we've talked about that in a lot of other videos. I won't go into that. But what's interesting about these things is that you'll hear from a lot of people dealing with fibromyalgia that they'll say, oh yeah, it gets worse at night. And that's not everybody, but a lot of times it's worse at night or just when they wake up in the morning after they've been in a more anabolic state that whole nighttime. So during the night, the body's moving even more into that anabolic state, so it really has the ability to elevate the symptoms that they're dealing with. Because now, all day they were kind of too far in that anabolic state, but at night they're moving even deeper into it, magnifying the imbalance they're already having. So that seems to be one thing that we can kind of keep an eye on if a client is having more pain at night or like right when they wake up. And another thing that can confirm this for us, we'll look at this study about high-dose omega-3 alters serum magnesium and calcium levels and affects fibromyalgia symptoms. So this study showed that, wow, if somebody used a whole bunch of omega-3 supplements, that they could improve these fibromyalgia symptoms. Well, omega-3s are very pro-catabolic. They push a person less anabolic. So it makes sense that it can improve this symptom for someone who's having it caused by being too far in that anabolic state. Not everybody dealing with this. Some clients are having it because they're too insulin resistant. But if this is the cause for them, omega-3s could really help them. You also hear about people saying, oh, if you take magnesium, it can help these symptoms. Well, magnesium is also very pro-catabolic. So it's just helping the body move out of that imbalance that's creating it for that individual. And that's another thing about exercise. And we look at this study on exercise therapy for fibromyalgia, and they kind of did this study. And their conclusion was that, exercise really has the ability to improve a lot of these symptoms for people, just like the studies that looked at this long ago. And long ago, back before my mom passed away, she had severe fibromyalgia issues. And the only advice they gave her was, oh, you have to exercise. And she's like, I can't exercise. I can't even stand up in the kitchen for 5 minutes. So she didn't feel like that was going to be a solution for her. And a lot of people feel the same way. But exercise is a pro-catabolic activity. So if a person can kind of work through that pain and do enough exercise, they have the ability to improve this anabolic imbalance. But another thing is that if a person can do enough exercise often enough, it can kind of force the body into need to using this form of energy production. So it can kind of change how the body's creating its energy, and it will do this a little bit less. But most clients are not going to be able to do that just because the pain's too much. They're going to give up on that because that can take quite some time to do. So we like to help them fix these other things until they can get to the point where they can include some exercise as well. But it's good that this exercising helping makes sense in multiple ways. Also, exercising can bring down the blood sugar, and now less calcium's going to the blood and alkalizing that bloodstream. So you can see some of these things can have multiple effects for different clients. And as we go into this next topic of a possible bacterial overgrowth in the digestive system, let's look at this study here on a systemic review of the association between fibromyalgia and functional gastrointestinal disorders. And they say that this review confirms previous reports that IBS is common in people living with fibromyalgia and suggests that IBS mixed and constipation types predominate. So we understand that if somebody is leaning too far on this anabolic side, that they're going to be constipated in most cases because the body's sending too much water to the kidneys and not enough to the bowels. But a lot of these other IBS type issues have to do with a bacterial overgrowth that a person is dealing with, or these digestive malfunctions, like either a lack of stomach acid or bile has become too thick and sticky to flow correctly. And either of those malfunctions going on, which both are very common to see today, but either of them have the ability to create these IBS type symptoms for a lot of folks. But let's look at this bacterial overgrowth specifically, because this may have to do with the, either converting lactic acid or excreting it situation. So this study here showed a link between irritable bowel syndrome and fibromyalgia may be related to findings on lactulose breath tests. And the lactulose breath test is something they look at to see if someone has a SIBO issue, or small intestinal bacterial overgrowth. So a bacterial overgrowth has taken place in the small intestine or in the stomach where they really shouldn't be. Our good bacteria should be in our large intestine. So when that's the case, they also have the ability to generate lactic acid. This bacteria can generate lactic acid, but it generates a different type. It generates D-lactic acid, and D-lactic acid can't be converted to glucose. It has to be excreted. So if a person's having a hard time excreting all of this lactic acid that may be high, this has the ability to really magnify that problem. If the major overgrowth is creating all of this lactic acid, and maybe the person has other issues here that we talked about that are also creating too much lactic acid through fermentation. Now they have lactic acid accumulating from different pathways. So that can really accumulate in a big way, and they're going to have an even harder time excreting any type of excess lactic acid. So if a client has a bacterial overgrowth, that really has to be corrected. There's a lot of steps that a client can take that are natural, that reduce an overgrowth. We have a lot of videos on that, and I talk about how to do that in that book as well. But when we're looking at reducing an overgrowth for a client, what's really important is that we close the front door. A lot of times the overgrowth came in and set up camp because they weren't making enough stomach acid. They weren't making enough hydrochloric acid. That's supposed to be the barrier to the whole digestive tract. When bacteria come in on the food that we're eating, they're supposed to die in an acid bath. But it's very common for clients not to be making enough stomach acid, and then they come in, they set up camp, and they have a keg party, and it's a great time. So when we take steps to reduce an overgrowth for the client, we also want to make sure we're fixing these digestive malfunctions so we're not leaving the front door open and they just get a new overgrowth 3 weeks later. And the last possible cause I want to talk about is a vitamin B1 or thiamine deficiency. And we'll look at this study here on an overview of type B lactic acidosis due to thiamine deficiency. And they show this chart here that shows that thiamine is a very important cofactor for this process to happen. So if a client doesn't have enough B1, then this can't happen, and the body's like, oh, I can't create any energy like this. Oh, well, I'll go over here. I'll do this. So when there's a B1 deficiency, the body's forced to create energy through fermentation, which we know is going to create all of those problems. So some things to think about is that B1 is involved in processing carbohydrates. So if a client is just eating all this processed junk and sugar and carbs all the time, then they could really be using up all the B1, and now there's not enough to process energy this way, and they got to move over here. So that's one way it could happen. Also, if there's these digestive malfunctions that we see are so common with IBS and all these other digestive issues and overgrowth, SIBO type things with fibromyalgia, well, if there's digestive malfunctions, they're not really breaking down their food correctly and getting all the vitamins and minerals out of that food. There's a lot of foods that most people eat that have B1, but if they can't digest their food correctly, they can't access that B1. So you'll see people out there that are saying, oh, just treat fibromyalgia by doing high dose B1. And some people have the ability to see improvement if a B1 deficiency is really what's causing the problem for them. But I see that most people do this. I've never used high dose B1 with a client to fix this, and I've helped a lot of people fix this and improve this issue greatly. But there's people out there that are seeing success with this, so I like people to understand this. And I don't see a problem with taking some B1 just in case this is a problem for a client. But if a client's going to supplement with B1, they really want to use a natural thiamine, not some type of synthetic B1 that they got at the drugstore, for cheap. You want to use a quality natural thiamine supplement. I'm not going to give out any brands, but that's really important. And if a client's going to supplement with any type of B vitamin, I like them to also take a B complex, maybe 2 or 3 times a week, just because all the cofactors that are in that B complex help them utilize a B1 better, or any type of B vitamin really. So I just like to take them, maybe 2 or 3 times a week, and that's usually enough for a B complex. So that was a whole lot of stuff that we kind of went over. You might have to watch this 2 or 3 times for everything to really sink in and make sense. But you can see that there's a variety of issues that can cause this to happen for a client. And because the scientific world is looking for one cause for fibromyalgia, they're never going to find it. All these different things can create the problem. So we really have to look at the client to figure out what's going on. That book that I talked about, That helps you understand how you can have clients run simple tests at home using tools they could pick up like at a pharmacy or a health food store to understand, are they leaning too far on this anabolic side? If they are, then the book teaches you steps you can help them take to improve that imbalance. But if you can look at a client's physiology and check their breath rate and look at their fasting blood sugar, then you can really start to get an idea of which of these steps is going to be more effective for that client. You won't want them doing all of this work if it's not really going to help them see results. We want to do the things that are going to help that particular client the most. So I hope this information can help you create some improvement for clients that are dealing with this. And if you want to understand this oxygen utilization issue a little bit more, you can jump over to our much bigger channel for consumers and check out our video on how to improve oxygen utilization. I can't wait to hear about your results.